I call Todd Muller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call this evening to support the first reading of the Child Protection Child Sex Offender Register Bill. Like my colleague Matt Ducey, I'd like to acknowledge Minister Tolley for her work in this area and bringing this bill to the floor of the House, but also Honourable Judith Collins in her previous ministerial roles. I know she had a particular advocacy for such a register. Mr Speaker, this bill is seeking to strike the right balance between protecting some of our most vulnerable children who are aged from a few months old through to 15 on the one side, and those on the other, the rights of those on the other who have committed these crimes, been found guilty for them, but returning back into the community and no doubt wanting a fair life as they do that. In my view, this bill, Mr Speaker, traverses that age-old tension between public safety on the one hand and individual rights on the other. But the bill that we are discussing this evening reflects a clear bias towards keeping our most vulnerable safe. And it is anchored in a view, Mr Speaker, that information tightly held that's used to inform risk and associated response is an appropriate framework to protect those who need our protection. But it does, of course, at the margins erode the rights of individuals. But it is, Mr Speaker, a balance I am comfortable with. And no doubt during the Select Committee process, when we'll hear a spectrum of views from those who are across New Zealand on this issue, I am going to listen with interest, and I'm sure most of our Select Committee will, to assure myself that we've landed on the right place, but I believe at the moment that we have. I also think it is right that we, as a Social Services Select Committee, reflect on it. This is a whole-of-government approach that this government has brought in to protect and look after our most vulnerable, particularly children. So I am very confident that under the leadership of Alfred Naro and the Deputy Chairmanship of Matt Ducey and others, we will have the appropriate discussion and traverse the areas that we need to. Mr Speaker, sexual offending against children is a serious problem that causes significant and long-lasting harm. Reported child sexual abuse is increasing. In 2012-13, 505 offenders were convicted of 1,819 sex offences against children, up 20% on the previous decade. And that, to be honest, is likely to be a lower than reality number because children of all of our community are less likely to have come forward in all cases if they have been offended against. But what we do know is that victims of child sex offenders are some of our most vulnerable in New Zealand. Their lack of emotional and physical and intellectual maturity puts them at serious disadvantage for those who are leveraging their often adult status. And these adverse effects, Mr Speaker, are significant. They can include chronic depression, low self-esteem, sexual dysfunction and personality disorders amongst others. And I guess more tragically, they often have an increased risk of being an offender in time themselves. Mr Speaker, the key problem that we are seeking to solve with this bill is to close the gaps in government information, collection and sharing systems that have become evident in reviewing recent incidents relating to reoffending. And I think this is a key point that we should bring out in this discussion, that this has occurred. We have seen situations where reoffending has occurred in society, and as we have looked deeply at the causes of that and what the conditions were in the place when that happened, it was the lack of information and the lack of sharing between relevant government ministries that were a contributing factor to that. So, Mr Speaker, this bill seeks to establish the Child Protection Offender Register, as we've heard this evening. It includes all offenders aged 18 years or older at the time of the offence who have been convicted of a qualifying child sex offence and, of course, are then sentenced to imprisonment. But it also enables a judge if it's a non-custodial sentence, to assess the risk profile of that individual and then also direct them to register on the register as well. And it also includes, Mr. Speaker, a condition to capture, if you like, on the register those who have committed these crimes in offshore jurisdictions but intend to live in New Zealand for more than 6 months. Again, as long as the offending was of similar threshold to what the equivalents would have been in New Zealand, they too will need to be registered on this proposed register. So, Mr. Speaker, spending a moment on the register itself, and I think it is worth here in this first reading just stepping through some of the components of that. It's going to have a range of personal information of these individuals, their names and other identifying particulars, address and the like, as you would expect. Details of each qualifying offence or corresponding offence if it was an offshore jurisdiction, the date they were sentenced, the date the registrable offender ceased to be in custody, and of course an obligation that if any of that information changes, they have to update the Ministry of Police, the Department of Police and Corrections within 72 hours of any change, or 48 hours if they are seeking to travel. And as importantly, Mr. Speaker, every 12 months there's an obligation to make sure that that has been reconfirmed as accurate. And it has already been discussed this evening, the timeframes in which they need to be on the register, 15 years or 8 years from the date they've been released from prison, or potentially for life, depending, of course, on the seriousness of the qualifying offence for which they were convicted. As a point of detail, Mr. Speaker, for those who are on this register because of their non-custodial sentence and judge direction, they are required to be on this register for 8 years. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the ongoing management of the register, we have obviously in this bill it is clear that Department of Corrections and Police will share the responsibility for managing that. I think again that's a very sensible and efficient conclusion. Department of Corrections, whilst they are in prison, once those on the register move out into the community, it then swaps over to the police to be the lead manager, if you like, of that interface. Agencies such as Ministry of Social Development and Housing New Zealand will of course continue to have limited access to the information, but they do have the capacity to have access to it if it's clear that it's in the interest of public safety. And obviously this information needs to be updated to establish a complete picture of emerging risk and reoffending. And I think this is a key component of this register, that it's not a static piece of data. Those with the greatest skills of being able to assess the risk profile of individuals can assess the data, can look at the trend line of recovery of the individual and build a particular support plan around them. And it is that interface, if you like, between the data and a management plan over time that reduces the risk on our vulnerable children in New Zealand. And Mr. Speaker, this is why I think it is a good bill, and I welcome the conversation that we are going to have as the Social Services Select Committee over the next few months. Thank you.
Kia ora.